Hi, I'm Darryn Keiller from Autogrow. I'm here with Henry Gordon-Smith, who's joining us from Brooklyn, New York, and Henry's the founder of Agritecture Consulting.
Yeah, I think it's exciting that this is just such a global topic. You know, anywhere you go, you kind of find that people are either already interested in this or increasingly interested in this topic of growing more food in controlled environments.
Yeah, I think so, but it's not a very well understood area. And I think that's the challenge, but it's also the opportunity for people like yourself and for Autogrow is the fact that it's not well understood, and yet people know that it's something they need to be learning about and getting involved in it somehow. So yeah, so I mean, I guess that segues kind of into the topic, or where we want to start, which is, you know, this whole idea of smart cities, you know, and you've been working in this space for around about 5 years, and I guess the question is, 5 years in, are cities any smarter?
Well, I think in some ways, you know, they are, in the sense that they've explored technology as it relates to making their cities smarter, which is the typical understanding of it. In other ways, they're not, meaning that they don't value the human needs, food, water, that are important and are really going to make a city smart and resilient. I think that's what we're trying to do. And it's been slow. It's been disappointing, to be honest, because it's about elected officials trying to get kind of their headlines and their stories. And I think that it's much easier to install citywide Wi-Fi than it is to create a program for long-term resilience in agriculture.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, farming is slow, right? It takes time to cultivate the skills, to cultivate the crops, to cultivate the operations. And so I think I still have a lot more to do as far as helping cities be smarter through agriculture.
Yeah, there's a few things to tease out there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one interesting thing is, you know, how detached we all are now from agriculture and where our food comes from. You know, so if you think about the 70 years that's passed since the Second World War, you know, that, you know, most of us had connections into family members who were farmers or had some connection to the farming sector, and almost all of that is gone now.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and people who've become urbanites are very much that. You know, they don't have a connection, and the cities don't have a connection back to food production or where the water comes from, because none of us consciously think about it. And yet, we've got these very confronting challenges coming to us all around the world with climate change and with water stress. You know, being that we're you know, utilizing the water so quickly that we're basically running out, which is again something people don't really want to talk about, but as we know it's happening. You know, I think it's really important that we get the general population, not just the city leaders, but get the general population connected again back to the idea of where does their food come from and what is involved to produce it. You know, and have people realize that urban density is only going to get more, you know, bigger, and you know, they need to become more conscientious about the role that's going to play.
I think it's an important point you're making about the disconnection, how we're disconnected from food. I mean, there's a consequence to that. I agree.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and for me, that's come about because of a, you know, personal experience over the last 4 years of getting into this industry, you know. So, but before I go into that, I mean, let me ask you, you know, why did you get into doing this in the first place? Because I think that would be a really interesting perspective on the whole subject.
Yeah, I grew up in big cities, right? So I grew up in Hong Kong and Tokyo all before the age of 10, and so I really had no green thumb whatsoever. So there was definitely not, I was not on a trajectory to be in agriculture. But in my undergraduate degree, when I was at the University of British Columbia, I started looking at Vancouver, and Vancouver has this plan to be greenest city by 2020. And very similar to my start into smart cities, I started seeing, well, where's the food plan, right? Like, there's water. There was a little bit on transportation, bike lanes, you know, green roofs, solar. Where's the food, right? Why isn't that part of the story? I started digging deeper, and I started seeing there's wait lists for community gardens. There's an average of 2 years, people waiting to have community gardens. People want to farm in the city. They want to have local food, but there's no mechanism, no policy mechanism. And as I dug deeper, it was like cities just don't get it. They just don't understand, because of that disconnect you mentioned earlier. They don't understand what agriculture is or how it works, what size, what can we grow, you know, what are the climate conditions we need for that. And so that disconnect to me was an opportunity. I said, here's a gap. Here's a story, something I can talk about. And I had some blogging background, and so I just started writing about that topic. And that's when I just, you know, through that process of researching it, I started learning about the different models and how they're different. Yeah. And that's what fascinated me, is that not all farms are the same, and that there is no silver bullet. And if we're looking at farms in Sydney versus New York versus Abu Dhabi, you know, they have totally different needs as far as scale, as far as labor requirements, all those issues. And so agritecture was about trying to find that. Like, what if we start thinking about agriculture from an architectural perspective, where you think about that local context and you use design thinking. And that's a new way of thinking about agriculture that I think is needed for the city.
Yeah.
So, and that's really where it began for me. So I mean, I had no experience, and I volunteered in farms. I moved to New York and just kind of tried out a bunch of stuff. And it was a long journey. I mean, it took me about 5 years of just researching before I had even any legitimacy or any recognition for the work I was doing.
Yeah. I mean, let me tease out a couple of things there. I mean, one thing I find really interesting that you said is this idea of people going back to community gardens, which to me seems kind of crazy because, I mean, that stuff to me seems like the dark ages, right? But are you saying that there's actually...
Why? Because it's low tech or?
Well, no, just because people stopped doing it, you know.
Yeah.
City gardens, community gardens, they all just became weeds, right? And are you saying that there actually has been people trying to come back into it?
So I looked at Vancouver, I looked at Portland, Seattle, and Montreal, and each of them had an average of 1.5 to 2 years waiting list for the community gardens that existed. So those plots, even though you might see some that are in disrepair, people want them. People are craving it. And I think that's a problem, right? That the people don't have a way to engage in that. I think as you dig deeper, it's that people actually want to do jobs around it, right? They want to create businesses. And that's probably what you see a lot more often. And I think that, again, goes to your question on the technology. And the problem with community gardens is they're not high tech. They're not extremely productive. They don't grow sellable product. And so they're sort of a short-term solution to food security and not really what we need. What we need is businesses around it.
Yeah.
You know?
For scale.
For scale.
Yeah, for scale. Yeah.
I mean, they provide meaningful impact, but I think for scale and this idea that, you know, we only have, in America, I think we've got 3% of the population that's involved in agriculture. Yeah. 100 years ago, that was 70%, right? Yeah. So it's like, you know, there's a consequence to having less and less people that know how to grow food.
Well, that's that change, right, that we were talking about, you know, that since World War II in particular, it's, you know, it just became not necessary, especially as commercial farming started happening at scale, right? People just didn't need to know anymore.
Yeah.
So look, if we talk about, move on maybe to the cities that are having a go at it, right? That are trying to make it real. You know, and we've both visited a lot of the major cities around the world, whether it's Singapore, Hong Kong, you know, many of the East Coast. Yeah. And that's the interesting thing with the US is why the East Coast and not the West Coast, right? I find that really hilarious, right? Because typically California, you know,
I mean, it's the ag state.
No, it's the ag state, but it's also kind of seen as the most progressive state, and yet it's really not doing much in this space. It's almost all the East Coast that's doing all this stuff. So maybe talk a little bit about, you know, where you're seeing, you know, at least an attempt by cities to bring in, to be inclusive of agriculture and urban greening and that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I want to hear about some of the Asian cities you've been working with a little bit, but on some of the cities I've experienced in Paris, for example, has been a really interesting leader in this, and they did a kind of citywide contest for urban agriculture, and they set a goal, a specific target. And I think that's really important. The cities that have specific targets are going to be more successful in getting there than if they're just like, we want to encourage this. So they said we want to have 30 hectares of urban agriculture space by 2020. Right. And there's 16 hectares in. They just launched their 3rd season of the competition. So I think there's like over 40 farms that have been developed from this competition alone in Paris. I think that's quite meaningful as far as what it does to connect the real estate developers to the issue. So now you have developers who are actually building buildings with the kind of preparations for greenhouses. Right. That's what you need, right? And that's the leadership. If you go to Atlanta, again, it's about leadership. They have the first director of urban ag in any city in the United States. That director, their entire purpose is to help the city understand urban agriculture, to encourage it. And what they've had to do there that's been tough is how do you balance this kind of trend towards high tech with the more kind of low cost community needs of agriculture that exist. You know, they have 25% of the population lives in food deserts. And so we created this Aglanta brand with the city of Atlanta to merge those two, to say these two don't have to be exclusive, right? There's spillover. There's things we can learn from each of those groups together. Yeah. And that's what they've been doing really effectively. So they're both attracting big companies to Atlanta to set up farms, but also they have this whole Grows a Lot program that converts lots into urban farming spaces at very low costs and free leases for I think 10 years for different urban farmers there. So it's just about creating access out of the unusable land in the city. That's what Paris is doing, that's what Atlanta is doing. Those are two good examples.
Yeah, they are. I mean, if I have a look at Asia, I mean, we work a lot with Singapore. You know, now the Singaporean government, I think, has probably got the most focused program. And there's a number of what I'll call these city-states. Mm-hmm. You know, that you know, because really they're countries, but they're cities, really. You know, whether it's, you know, Hong Kong now is a special administrative region of China. So even though it's now part of China, it still kind of has this semi-autonomous kind of operation. In both cases, you know, they're trying to look at food security and being more self-sustainable, but more particularly it's driven by having safe products, healthy, safe products that they can create locally. Singapore, I think, you know, started off actually more with urban greening,
Right.
And then they kind of started to bring the idea of, urban vertical agriculture in. So there's around 20 farms there, all hydroponic. Autogrow's involved with 16 of those.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And then Hong Kong, turns out, they've got 40 hydroponic farms, 12 urban vertical, 28 greenhouses in the new territories. And I don't think anybody knows that, you know what I mean? There's a policy commitment, and I guess that's where it starts with any government.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for a lot of governments to actually do that top-down policy implementation, right? And I think those city-states maybe have a better chance. If you look at Dubai, UAE, they also, they want to be top 10 in food security globally. Wow, like that's an ambitious goal for pretty much a desert country.
Yeah.
So we'll see what they can do, but I think they can make those kind of executive decisions that's a lot more difficult and slower for the average city to make. And New York has been a very, very slow process.
Right.
You have this kind of paradox there where you've got a lot of investment going into ag tech. You've got a lot of entrepreneurs that want to do it. You've got consumers and supermarkets that want to buy the product, but you don't have the policy support.
Right.
Right.
But that's ironic, isn't it?
It's
given that really
depressing,
we often talk of New York as well as Toronto as being like the birthplace of urban vertical farming, which is only roughly 10 years old. So I find it surprising that New York, of all places, would be behind.
I mean, I think I think that they have the potential to be a great leader, but I think Paris really responded to this idea that there's young people everywhere that want to do this, and if we can encourage them, we can actually have them green the city with their own business models. It doesn't need to be this, hey, let's green the city through urban agriculture in a kind of socialist way. It can actually be very much driven by entrepreneurship, and that's what Paris has done. I think that's what Singapore is trying to do as well, or has done a lot of as well. But I think in New York they've just kind of stifled a little bit because they're looking for maybe big job creators, and I think they don't recognize that a lot of these startups may start with a few jobs at the beginning, but as they get investment, as they grow, they're impacting resilience, and they are going to be larger companies if they're given a little bit of support.
Yeah.
Just like recognition.
So, one thing to talk about is, the rise of vertical farming. We just touched on it and its birthplace sort of being in the Northeast US.
Yeah.
And now taken on actually by other places around the world. It's a very hot topic. And I think it's given a lot of media coverage because of the amount of venture capital that's been pouring in to the sector. But what I find interesting about it, and I'd be interested in your opinion, is when I've analyzed all these farms, the reality is only half of them are actually innovating, or barely half are innovating. So if I have a look at Aero Farms and Plenty, at least based on what they publicly present, they're trying to innovate. They're genuinely trying to innovate, and all the money's going into innovation. If we have a look at Bright Farms and Gotham Greens and Bowery, really they're using existing technologies, and there is no, from my perspective, there's really no innovation. It's more of just a proximity to market play, which is valid in its own right, but it's not innovation when you're just building Dutch houses, whether you put them on the roof of a building or putting a warehouse facade on the front of it.
Yeah.
I mean, what's your take on the whole?
I mean, I think, look, I've been in this space for a while, and vertical farming certainly for me was a part of the attraction, but it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all the problems, and I think that if you look at Bright Farms, for example, when I applied for a job with them, they were doing facades and rooftops, and that attracted to me them as a company. But now they're doing kind of these ground floor, 100,000 square foot, very traditional greenhouses near supermarkets. I don't know if I have a problem with that explicitly, because like in the end they are still farming and they're figuring out those models, and we need more of that. But I do think that the hype that exists in that initial stage isn't necessarily very productive. Unless you're really going to innovate, don't try and talk about how you're changing the world in this major way. Just be traditional. Just admit.
Well, they're a farming company.
Admit that, yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
That's basically what they're doing.
Company.
I think what David's doing with Aero Farms is a lot more interesting. I mean, the challenge he has is obviously getting scale, right? Being able to reproduce the model.
Just the capital costs of those projects are so enormous.
It's huge, right?
And I think there's still a question remains: does the consumer really want that product enough? I think when we're in this space a lot, we talk about it, right? We're local food, all of that. We see data around local food, but does the consumer really go to that store and say that Aero Farms product is better, than the organic girl? Can they really tell the difference? Do they really know that? Because if they're not going to be buying that product every single week off that shelf, then there's not going to be justification for those big scale farms. And I think that remains to be seen. At Agritecture, we work a lot more with smaller farms, and they're not focused on tech innovation. They're focused on mostly supplying some kind of demand that they found in a market. But because they're smaller, I think they are able to get their money back quicker. They're able to connect with the customer. They're recognized as kind of a small-scale local farmer in a way that the big farms can't. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see in the next few years how Aero Farms and these other big companies navigate that.
Yeah. You know, you and I, we're reasonably prolific on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
And it's important because I think it's a really good, social media for business people.
Totally.
What I find really fascinating over the last three years or so has been this kind of like battle that's been going on between the traditional greenhouse growers and the vertical urban farming guys, right?
Definitely.
Which really, on the whole, I find completely ridiculous. I mean, basically, you got a whole bunch of old white men, if I can say it, in their 60s. Who are basically going, we've been growing for 50 years and this is the way you grow, and then you've got the new guys sort of saying, well, actually, hey, we've got this new way
Future
of doing
farming,
things.
this is...
And they're all at war with each other. And it's like, well, actually, guys, I think the point here is we just need to produce more.
Right. It's a pretty big market to disrupt, right? And there's a lot of room.
And I mean, we see huge investment still going on in greenhouse production. Yeah. And I think we tallied up the numbers, and if you took all the venture capital that's been raised for urban vertical farms, it's maybe $500 million in the last couple of years. Reasonable amount of money, but there's about 30 billion a year going into greenhouse expansion and upgrades and so on. And the reality is we need both forms of controlled environment farming on the up.
Well, I think on the job side, I see vertical farming as a gateway technology. I think it attracts a lot of people into it. And I think we get a lot of leads that come to us say, I want to build a vertical farm. And I end up telling them you should build a greenhouse. When you compare the carbon footprint of greenhouses versus vertical farming, I mean, there's a kind of an ugly elephant in the room when it comes to vertical farming and the CO2 footprint of that if it's drawing energy from a coal source, for example.
Right.
And so how sustainable can you really call a vertical farm, And I think that there's a lot of media press around that has created this kind of negative feedback loop of this is the future of farming and this kind of clickbait you see there that also then creates these entrepreneurs that are like, oh, this is the way to do it. But with that said, I think it's about context. And the way we approach it is we say, every single context matters. If I'm building a farm in Saudi Arabia, a greenhouse is going to be extremely difficult to run in the summertime. And actually the cost of cooling that greenhouse in the summertime are going to be really, really significant. So if I can convert a warehouse space, or if I can build an efficient warehouse there, how does that compete? And we find the numbers are pretty competitive in that region. So I think it's not about saying that greenhouses are better than vertical farms. I think it's about saying, what does the site provide and what's the unique context? And I think that's why we try to remain independent of those technologies. We try to say, we want to talk to you about those options and show you those trade-offs so you can make that decision. But I think if you're just looking at carbon footprint, for example, I think there's a lot of ideas that vertical farms are sustainable every single time, and it's just not true. I think you have to really look at all the factors contained, the labor it's creating, the water consumption, the embodied energy of all that equipment together. Those lights don't last forever, right? So you don't have to replace those lights. So I think it's a lot deeper questions are needed, and I'm excited to always talk to you about the more complexity here.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question that what we're seeing overall is this shift from outdoor to indoor.
Yeah.
Right. And everybody talks about the impact of what we're seeing with the climate shift and the weather shift in weather patterns, and and putting aside the politics of how we got here, they're all realities, right? And so we're seeing a huge shift into protected cropping. Tunnel houses, net houses, basically any form of protection, which sometimes climatic defense, but sometimes it's also pest and pathogen, because that's another really interesting thing. We talk a lot about the technology, but there's also we're dealing with biologics, right? So the reality is that what's happening with the planet warming is that more pests and pathogens are incubating and breaking out.
Moving to different areas than they weren't before.
Yeah, and it's playing havoc.
I think it's about adaptation. I think all of this is about adaptation to climate change. There's a lot of focus on mitigation. How can we stop it? And that's somebody else's work. But I see my work a lot on adaptation. If we don't accelerate the models that people can use to adapt to climate change and still produce food, I think we don't have a lot of hope of really maintaining our existence around cities.
Yeah.
I think we have to sacrifice a lot more than we're prepared to do.
I agree that we invest across all three areas, protected cropping, greenhouses, and urban vertical farms. And I think, because they're all, they're fit for purpose, which is kind of what you were saying. Look at the landscape that you're dealing with, look at the localized need, and then you've got to choose the right infrastructure and the right crops. That's another thing we look at, is are you growing the right thing, not just because of local demand, but because actually your microclimate that you're growing in is suited to producing that type of crop. But look, I think, and you know, as we head towards increasing urbanization, it is, you know, especially with really high density cities coming up, you know, mega cities, you know, populations of 20 million, 30 million are on the horizon in Asia and in Africa.
Yeah.
You know, and they're going to have food that's produced in those cities. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is with some form of urban-based system. That's just reality.
Yeah, I mean, in the least, cities in the future are going to have to be defining how the agriculture system works, right? I mean, in Australia, I think it's 86% of the population lives in cities, right? So that's enormously significant. So that needs to be driving where our food comes from, how our food is grown, and how it gets to the city. And it's not today.
Yeah.
They're too disconnected.
And it's interesting when you look at smaller countries. So if we have a look at, I mean, the Scandinavians have been good at picking up on the urban vertical thing.
Now they are, yeah.
Yeah. You know, and it makes sense. You know,
it works there actually.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
The produce pricing is really high.
And they can afford it. The economies are wealthy enough to be able to afford it. But you know, again, you're dealing with highly concentrated populations, and you know, and so you can grow and serve in the same space. I think the really interesting challenge is for the US and for China and for Africa, because the populations are so, even with the concentrations, you're dealing with such vast geographies. You know, that's really the biggest, toughest nut to crack, is how we're going to provide food in the future in those markets.
I have to be honest, I do little to no work in Africa, and so I'm just curious, does Autogrow do work there, and what do you think the future of food in Africa is?
We're just getting more inquiry. I mean, obviously we read a lot. I mean, you and I both read a lot on what's going on, and we talk to a lot of people, and you know, the UN's predicting, you know, that it's going to be the largest population by 2050, and what's interesting, it's going to be the youngest as well. So something like, you know, 30% of the population is going to be under 20.
Yeah.
And you know, and they've got to feed everybody, and they've got to do it with a little water. So I think that there's some really big macro challenges there, and the NGOs have been climbing in, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, people like that. You know, but I don't think the commercial world has turned its lens towards it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think cities that want to get involved in smart agriculture or any smart city movement, they really need to listen to the people first. And I think the biggest mistake I see is that people are making these big macro decisions without consulting through town halls. We saw that with Amazon, right? People picketing with the frowny face of Amazon, kicking them out. And I think that is going to be part of this future. I'd love to see more citizens demanding that as well, saying this is the kind of smart cities we want. But we've seen some problems in Toronto with the Sidewalk Labs project and privacy. So I think it's just not that easy for these projects to get developed. And I think the first step is just listening to people.
Do you think this comes back to education again? Because, you know, I find it interesting. You know, my son's 21, right? So he's square in that millennial kind of group. And they seem to be have a high level of consciousness about, say, the planet, duty and care towards the planet, and you know, what they eat. You know, do you think there's this? It feels to me like a lot more still needs to be done to educate everybody on what's happening and why they need to get involved in the conversation.
I mean, you know, I think young people, yes, they could use more education, but when we're talking about cities, it's like molasses. It's so slow. I mean, for example, in New York, we were lobbying the city for 4 or 5 years, and they ended up building a website. Like, that was the result of 4 years. We had gathered all the urban farms in New York. Arrow Farms was part of it, Bowery, Square Bridge, all these big farms were part of this. They said, this is how much we grow, this is how many jobs we're going to create. These are our needs around policy. I mean, we basically gave them the gift of a comprehensive plan for urban agriculture, and we ended up with a website. How can we work with that?
Yeah.
I was talking about it earlier. I mean, I was so naive about it. And the fact is, these things do take time. And I don't know what the balance is, to be honest. I think it really is a balance between top down and bottom up. You know, we need the entrepreneurship. And so I think what really works, well, I guess what my vision is now when I work with cities more is to say, well, let's find for-profit ways of accelerating entrepreneurship. Because in the end, I think that will start to push the cities beyond that brink.
I'd agree with that. And look, I think that, to be honest with you, solving a lot of these problems or many of these challenges is actually going to come from private enterprise.
Right.
I mean, I just don't think government is government anywhere is in a. You
should have told me that 5 years ago, Darren.
Just works in a way that it can accelerate these things.
I kind of get that, but it's also kind of bullshit, right? Because you've got cities everywhere who are like investing in transportation technology, right? I was at an event the other day, there was this woman, she had this amazing technology, lets you look at streets. And if one street has more pedestrian or more trains or more this and that, she has 30 cities on board with her platform. Why? why would a city invest in that and not its own food production, or at least driving food production or creating jobs in food production? Where's the disconnect? How can I break that? How can I make agriculture as important to cities as Wi-Fi is to cities?
Look, I think it's a great challenge. I'm sitting here thinking, what is the answer to that? I don't know. I think that
I thought it was big data. I thought it was like, okay, this was my idea, right? It's like, okay, if we can get the city to say, I've got all this available space, tell me how much I can grow with that, and tell me what the scenarios are to be successful, to achieve a certain goal, more equity, more production, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it's like a nice story, but then you face these other issues around funding. And I think the transportation departments, for example, have had decades of funding that they've utilized. I think it's going to take a while before. That's why you need a directive of urban ag. It's going to take a while before there's actually any funding to make those decisions.
You know what I mean? Like these guys aren't going to solve the problem. They're just not going to solve it, right?
No, they're not. And
they're nice people.
But my brain goes like, it just blows up, because it's like, how can you talk about affordable housing and not talk about affordable food? It's like the more people that live in a place, the more people eat food. And so if you're for example urbanizing, like you look in Sydney, right? Sydney has 20% of the consumption of food is local.
Yeah.
That's going to be 6% by 2031, according to the research done here. That's fine if you look at one city, right? One city urbanizing, that's a problem, that's not great. But if Sydney's doing it, if Hong Kong's doing it, if New York's doing it, that all these cities assume there's going to be unlimited cheap food that you can import. But every single city is basically expanding. In Auckland, you see this expanding onto its arable land by just building concrete and affordable housing. That's not going to last. Like there's going to be consequences.
It's not, and this is part of the freight train of badness that's coming, right? Is that people are assuming they're going to be able to keep importing, but what they're not taking into account is the exporters of those products are going to stop exporting because they're going to need it for local consumption.
Right. Or someone will pay more, right?
Or someone will pay more.
Another city will pay more.
Yeah. And cities are going to be left hanging in the balance, right?
But I think you're right, it has to be private enterprise. That's where that innovation has to come. And I think controlled environments can provide that, because you can grow more per square foot, you can get more control, you can have more agility to what's happening in the environment. As long as we can get the diversity of crops up, I think there's a big future for that.
Yeah, look, and I mean the great thing with indoor farming is that you can produce pretty much anything you can imagine. The question is, can you produce it economically?
Yeah.
Right, and that's kind of where I guess the investments we're making in more advanced technology come into it, right? I mean, that's part of the solution is in high tech. That's where high tech does play a role.
Right.
How can we replicate environments and, do the nutrient feed and the water supply in a way that it can grow an orange in a greenhouse or in an urban vertical farm?
We were talking about private enterprise, right? And so there's kind of these really interesting, PPPs, public-private partnerships, where you can have education institutions partnering with private companies to accelerate this industry. So, I've been in conversations with GE or our client Southern Company, like how utilities can get involved to create incentives for vertical farmers to move in and use that energy load, and like how that could accelerate. You just need to create some incentives to accelerate and create those pathways for new farmers.
Yes.
I think if they get that first step, that first pilot farm, that first opportunity to experiment, they're so much better prepared for the business later on. And I think that's where the focus should be. Is not, hey, let's give everybody space for farming necessarily.
Yeah.
Let's just create meaningful accelerators, meaningful incubators to incubate the private enterprises of the future that are going to help us be more resilient to climate change through controlled environment agriculture. I mean, that's what I want to see more. So we're working on that in New York, working on that in Atlanta. We did some work on that in Saudi Arabia. I'd like to see more of it globally.
Yeah, and look, I think that's where we both play a role. We're coming at it from slightly different angles, but the work we're doing with various governments is around educating them on approach and actually how to make it happen. And obviously, from our perspective, we look at it more from how we will be able to provide autonomous farming systems that are highly intelligent, because a lot of the knowledge of how to grow is actually embedded in the system. Another challenge we're trying to deal with is the fact that all the growers are retiring, all the farmers are, getting to the age where they're retiring, and generationally, their kids haven't come into it. I mean, sometimes their grandchildren have, but that's another issue. And, and it's complex. I mean, this is kind of the other thing we talk about is that, we're not an app company, right? I mean, we're dealing with a very complicated set of factors, and we're trying to build a very sophisticated solution for it.
So, I mean, I'm really interested in this idea of the autonomous greenhouse, right, and the autonomous farm in the future, because I think what it does is it moves farming from being about subsistence to being more living wage, actually, profitable work. And I think that is also very exciting when you bring the technology. That's what's going to attract young people, right? In the Elon Musk era, people want to work with robots, people want to work with big data. Autogrow provides a lot of that. But I'm just curious a little bit on your vision for the autonomous greenhouse of the future. Where are we, and how far away are we from that?
Oh, look, I think within 3 to 5 years, you can certainly have a semi-autonomous farming system. I mean, some of the stuff we're doing includes voice interaction, being able to talk to the system, have it respond to you. We've already proven all of that in prototyping. And, and what it does do, to your point, is it allows more high value jobs to be created, right? So we're talking about the digital farmer, and that's part of the vision, right? The autonomous farm is kind of like, I guess, the engineering and the tech level of it, but it's from an operator perspective, it's the digital farmer, right? Someone who knows how to interact with technology, which a lot of farmers don't. They're uncomfortable with it. They've maybe got to the point where they're using a downloadable app for weather forecasting or something, but the idea that they might run the whole farm, using some form of computing system is kind of fairly radical at this point. But for young people, that's. But
I think for young people, it's really cool and sexy, right? But I'm just curious, why do you think, just to dive deep into this topic, why do you think young people, or so many people, are obsessed with the vertical farm versus the high-tech autonomous greenhouse? Because I think that's really exciting too.
Look, I just think the guys behind the vertical farming systems have done great marketing. They've really sold the vision, sold the story. The fact they're based in the cities, which means you don't have to leave the city. I mean, basically you can have a rooftop garden, you put a shipping container in a car park next to a restaurant. I mean, it makes it very easy for you to still retain your urban lifestyle and be an urban farmer. I think it's a cool proposition. I definitely see the appeal. From a scale point of view, it kind of keeps coming back to this. There's a lot of that volumetric production will come from greenhouses still. But populated with robotics and artificial intelligence rather than with imported labor.
What is the worst thing you hear in the news about vertical farming? Like the most bullshit or the most frustrating thing you hear?
I mean, look, I'm very supportive of the vertical farming movement, and that's why I've been reluctant to be critical of it. Because I don't want to negatively affect something that I actually think is a really good idea in principle, right?
But it's not being negative towards vertical farming when we talk about the fact that there have been multiple vertical farms that have raised money and failed. That's not negative. That's actually productive, because now we can talk about what didn't work.
Sure.
But if we talk about vertical farming as though it's kind of a silver bullet, sunshine and butterflies approach, sure, that might drive investment, that might drive clicks, but that doesn't really help us figure out the model.
Well, that is the part that annoys me, right? So the part that frustrates me is the claims. Right. So the thing that I just, and I'm not going to name names, right?
No, that's not the point.
But basically, when I hear some of the claims that are made about doing, viticultural production, for example, when we're barely past being able to produce strawberries, and I just think it's ludicrous, and I think it's overselling what's achievable within the near term.
Yeah, and that's not necessary, right? Because even if you look at the leafy green category, or if you look at berries, that's a large addressable market of imported product that's using too many resources, a pesticide use, water, and vertical farming can solve those problems in a lot of ways.
It can. Look, probably one of the other things that really
now we're getting
gets me going is the claims about the number of farms they're going to build, right? So one of them, who shall remain nameless, putting a claim out that they're going to build 300 farms. And I'm like, that's just fantasy, right? I mean, the capital requirement alone is so enormous, and they haven't even got one farm that's actually profitable or producing, to the best of our knowledge. So I think it's that type of thing that really gets me going, especially when there's tens of thousands of existing farms that just need to be modernized, which in terms of actually, I guess, practically addressing the challenges we have is much more accessible. Like, that's something you can reach out to and actually do something about, and that's what Autogrow is focusing on. That's why I had the vision. It was like about, well, we can impact the industry now.